I think all of us are here tonight because we're committed to and concerned about the diversity of our communities and justice for individuals who are often overlooked. And for universities, we thrive on diversity, diversity of thought, diversity of background, diversity of ethnicity, diversity across every dimension. And that's why the discussion tonight is so important to us at the University of Hawaii. For me personally, this became, so I was an IT guy before, right? Not much diversity in that world. But after the 2016 election and I was president, it became apparent that our nation had changed. And the fear within our community, among our students in particular, but others, was really quite palpable across this campus and all of the campuses of the University of Hawaii. Our international students were worried. We have undocumented students who are worried. And I try to understand what will it take for us to help these individuals understand that we welcome them, we care about them, and within the boundaries of the law, we will protect them. So among our tasks has been figuring out what we can do, and I'm looking forward to getting pointers here tonight from universities that may be ahead of us and have figured it out better. But I want to thank many of you here today who have helped us. Soon after this issue became apparent to me, and it was brought to my attention by a number of you who are more familiar with the challenges and the real-life obstacles, particularly of undocumented residents of Hawaii. We formed a task force, and I want to thank all of you. How about if you're on the task force, would you just raise your hand here tonight? Yeah, so thanks. These are the people who for UH have helped us figure out how to do it better. I'm sure it won't surprise you that presidents don't actually have the answers to everything. And certainly this president doesn't. But what presidents can do is convene and ask for help. And that's what we did in this situation. We have a number of things we've done. Our new website is not quite released, but our team that's worked on helping undocumented members of our community understand how we can help them is about to go live. We've created, we've clarified in our policy. I want to thank Amy was a part of this. Thank you. We now give resident tuition to undocumented residents of Hawaii. It did not require a law. This is something the university did for ourselves, unlike in many states. And it's interesting because we often don't get credit for that because it didn't take a law. We just did it. We have a new immigration clinic. I want to thank John is here. Wave. I had to talk his boss, Avi, into hiring somebody to do this work, and I'm delighted that it was John. But Avi stepped up in our law school, and it's a really fabulous example of how universities integrate education with community service. And John gets to work with our amazing law students to help support members of our community who need help. For us, we have something like 1,000 students and 70 faculty who have visas in order to arrive here, who are nervous under this administration. We have many more who are born abroad and speak another language, and we're not as their first language, and we're not always as thoughtful as we probably need to be about welcoming them within the University of Hawaii community. But it's also about our research focus as well. We are an Asia-Pacific institution. We are a Hawaii institution, and that carries with it a number of obligations as well to help serve and support those particularly from those regions, although not exclusively from those regions. And our faculty think about this every day in their scholarship, in their education, and in their support and relationships of our students. So let me close. I know I'm waxing on. I'm really honored to be here to get to start this program today. I'm glad to have had this opportunity to acknowledge the work of so many people who have helped us be more welcoming, more cognizant of our responsibilities to be a global university that is welcoming to all. So with that, let me ask our LG, Lieutenant Governor, Dr. Josh Green, to do the introduction of our guest speaker.
I get to do the fun stuff. So aloha, everyone. Thanks for coming out on a Friday night. I get to introduce Marielena Hincapié, who I got to have breakfast with this morning with many of our thought leaders like you, and just an extraordinary person. When you imagine what the face of the person who is going to joust with Donald Trump should look like, or does look like, it turns out it's a Colombian woman who is a scholar and a heartfelt leader of people and a crusader for civil rights. And until this morning, I didn't know what that person looked like. I know what our AG looks like. I know what our last AG looks like. They're pretty cool and have been jousting also with the administration. But to imagine what the person looks like thinks of civil rights, immigration rights, in the moments after a Muslim ban. And then we get to have them here with us for an evening or a few days. It's just fabulous. So Perk, President, all of you guys who organized this, on behalf of the Gov and myself, and past Gov, who I see Gov Abercrombie here, who is awesome, is a crusader also for human rights. To be able to come and have you share your experiences, we are just lucky. We're so lucky. Marielena is the youngest of 10 children. So you can imagine she learned to fight for one's rights very early in life. And she's become a champion of our rights for immigration and civil rights, but social justice and a social justice life, which is what we're able to learn about her today. She is the executive director of the National Immigration Law Center. And that is not something to trifle with, I will tell you. To be based both East and West Coast, to know what's coming down legally down the pike, and to know how to fight it professionally immediately is extremely valuable to our nation. So again, I feel just plain lucky today. Marielena won the Corazon Award in 2013. She won a National Public Service Award from Stanford. She was educated at Northeastern for her law degree, has lectured and been a professional with Northwestern and Berkeley. This person is a star. She grew up, like I said, a youngster, and she told us today she thought she might be a DEA agent early in life, which was more than a little bit fun to imagine. But I'm personally grateful as an American citizen that instead you became a champion for immigration rights. We have a lot of immigrants in our state. We all have relatives who are immigrants. My grandfather, who came from Poland, was named Joshua, but they couldn't pronounce it and changed his name to Sam. And so it was a slightly different battle in 1920 for Jews from Poland. But there have been fighters for civil rights and immigration rights then, in that generation long ago. And there are champions like today, who is our honored guest speaker. So thank you. We are so honored to have you. Marielena, please join us and wow us with your experiences. Thank you for being here.
Aloha. Buenas noches. Ooh, I think I am going to have some backdrop. Do I turn this off? Okay, I think that works. Great. Thank you so much, LG. I like the idea of calling you LG. Thank you so much for that introduction. And of course to Robert, who I have been learning on this trip is a force of nature and has been really the one behind this entire event and the speaker series. So yes, let's applaud. And a special thank you to the entire team at the University of Hawaii, to President Lassner, for your leadership at the university, but also, again, I got a chance to meet many folks from the university. What an incredible community of folks. I don't know that I see Dean Avi here, who I've gotten a chance to meet personally over the last few years. And then, of course, to the Hawaii Community Foundation that has been a real important leader behind, again, this series, who I've gotten a chance to meet a number of the folks from their staff. So very grateful to all of you for joining me on a Friday night. This is such a beautiful piece of paradise where you live. And so I know for a fact that there are many, many more wonderful things for you to be doing. So I appreciate that you have decided to spend this evening here. We are in the midst of one of the most dangerous moments in this country's recent history. And we are experiencing what I call collective trauma, national anxiety, given the pain, the fear, the confusion that so many migrants, refugees, Muslims, poor people, Black people, trans people, many of us simply who care about humanity are experiencing in this moment. So many people who are asking themselves, how did we get here? How is it that we are here in this nation? When our democratic institutions ranging from the free press to the voting booth are constantly being attacked. When many of us wonder, are we on the brink of fascism and authoritarianism? But despite all of this, I'm actually very optimistic about our collective future. And the reason for that is that I've been learning from some recent mistakes. And tonight I'm going to talk to you about the mistakes I've made. One is thinking that this was business as usual. Second was underestimating the core strategy of this administration. And finally, having a policy or legally centered approach to this current fight. But please don't think that I'm naive. When I say that I'm optimistic, I say that knowing that as a Latina, as an immigrant from Colombia who grew up in a low-income family, as a woman, I know at a deeply personal level that this is a dangerous time. I also know that if my family were trying to migrate today from Colombia, we would not be considered worthy of being here in this country. I would not be standing here with all of you today. My father was recruited as a textile factory worker to Rhode Island from Colombia because as a textile worker, he was a skilled worker, and that was valued. He was valued, his humanity was valued, and our immigration laws, which were fought by the civil rights movement in 1965, opened up and did away with national origin and racial quotas. And so my father, Arturo, was able to come to the United States to work in a factory at a time that the immigration laws allowed him to get a green card and petition for my 9 brothers and sisters, my mother and me. My mother and he worked in factories, they earned minimum wage, and the fact that they had 10 children, the fact that they didn't speak English, that they had limited English, limited education, all of those factors today would actually be used to exclude them from being here. Those are the factors that this current administration today is saying makes somebody unworthy of being here. And that is why we are currently experiencing a situation with a new wealth test, a wealth and racial test to decide who gets to come to this nation, who gets to be here, who is considered worthy of being here. And I am not one of those people unless we're able to change the direction of this country. But through my parents' deep personal sacrifices, they came to this nation just like millions of immigrants and refugees have done throughout our history, which was basically to give us, their children, a better life, just like millions of immigrants and refugees have done throughout our history. They believed in that elusive promise of equality, of freedom, and justice for all of us, regardless of whether people are migrating from Japan, from the Philippines, from Colombia, regardless of whether they are Muslim, they're Jewish, they're Catholic. It is the same reason many people continue seeking safety in this nation, continue migrating to this nation with the hope and the dreams of having a better life for their children and themselves. My parents made immense personal sacrifices, which meant that my 9 brothers and sisters and I did, in fact, have a better life. Among my siblings, I get to count educators like some of you. I have health professionals. My brother's a physical therapist. I have a sister who is a biochemist after having been a high school dropout in Rhode Island. I have business managers and small business owners. I have a niece who has invented the technology that allows any of you who buy online, who do online shopping for clothes based on measurements. My niece Jessica is the one who invented that technology. I have a niece who is a junior in high school who just a couple of weeks ago argued as part of her youth government class, argued 2 bills that she herself, a junior in high school, drafted, one to do away with solitary confinement and another to protect DACA students. This is why I am so hopeful. It's young people who have a beautiful, different future in their mind, who are already dreaming about a different reality. And I know that the sacrifices my parents made so that we in my family could have this impact on this country, I know that my family, just like your family, is exactly what makes America great, despite what somebody who is occupying the White House thinks. I want to know, what is it that we are going to do different today? Because it is not business as usual. And I want to share with you some of my mistakes. As I mentioned, the first mistake I made was that I thought that I could continue using the same advocacy and strategies I had in previous years under the Obama administration, under the Bush, Clinton administrations, but I was wrong. And the first momentary lapse in judgment I had was after having started and preparing for what a Trump administration would look like. During the summer of 2016, I was traveling a lot throughout the United States and had the opportunity to meet with a lot of young people, especially young people of color. And young person after young person kept telling me they had no interest in voting in November elections that year because they were uninspired by the candidates. I also heard young people saying, why vote? What does it matter? How do elections affect me? And I also heard young people saying, my vote doesn't matter, so I'm not going to vote. I was able to get many of them to register on the spot and actually, hopefully they did actually follow through and voted. But when I was hearing those young people, it gave me great concern about the future of our nation. And then around the same time, in the UK, 50.9% of British people voted in favor of Brexit to leave the EU based on anti-immigrant, anti-Muslim sentiments. On October 2nd, on a Sunday afternoon, I will never forget, the month before our elections here, in Colombia, where I was born, 50.2% of Colombianos voted against the peace process to end a 50-year civil war. And it was that combination, young people feeling disenfranchised in the US, especially young people of color. It was voters in the UK voting for Brexit and voters in Colombia voting against peace that said to me, we have to be prepared because this is likely to happen here. And I had our team, and I want to recognize my colleague Adela de la Torre, who's sitting with me. Basically, we started preparing for a Trump administration and a Clinton administration. And I remember on election day in particular, Adela had helped to draft a press statement for a Clinton win and one for a Trump win. We had a fact sheet already drafted for immigrant communities so that if Trump won, we would be able to ensure that immigrant communities heard immediately that although candidate Trump had been elected, the constitutional still was in place, that there was still a democracy in place, that they still had rights. We wanted to assure them. I remember talking to Adela at about 8 o'clock that evening, and although she kept sending me a Clinton draft to review, I couldn't even edit it, and I was like, no, let me review the Trump one. And it was just that intuition that our country and our democracy was at risk. And so once Trump got in office, we had been preparing. You know, we had been doing legal research. We were preparing for a Muslim registry. We were preparing for DACA to end. We had a sense of what this administration was going to be like. But I can assure you that nothing prepared us for the reality. That first week, this administration started and kicked off their administration with a shock and awe approach. Executive order after executive order, sending a very clear message to immigrants and refugees that they were not only no longer wanted here, but that they were going to be hunted down like animals, because that is exactly how this administration views us. They do not think of us as human beings. They do not respect our humanity. They think of us as animals, as objects to be killed. And so it was on Friday, January 27th, when I made that first mistake, that lapse in judgment, when the Muslim ban, the executive order on the Muslim ban was issued. And I remember the first call that we got was actually about San Francisco International Airport, and that was about an Afghani family, a family from Afghanistan, which wasn't even one of the countries listed on the Muslim ban, that was being denied entry. We were able, through some advocacy, get that family in. The second call we got, though, was on behalf of Mr. Darwish, who had been stranded at JFK and had been detained. Now, Mr. Darwish was an Iraqi refugee. He was an interpreter that assisted the US military for a decade. And because he assisted the United States by interpreting for our government, he and his family started receiving death threats. And he applied to come to the United States to seek safety in our land. And instead, when he arrived at JFK, he was separated from his family, from his wife and children, and taken into custody. And it was at that moment when my team started telling me what was happening, that I was like, I'll just pick up the phone. I will call Department of Homeland Security headquarters. I will do what I've always done under previous administrations and get people out of detention when there's no other resort. And it was not until 11:30 p.m. on that Friday night on the East Coast that I got a call back from headquarters. And basically they said, Marielena, we haven't even read the executive order. We don't have a directive. We don't know what we're going to tell airports. And so check the website. Maybe there's an update over the weekend, but we'll let you know if there's any change on Monday. And it was at that moment that I knew that I had made a mistake. It was no longer business as usual, and that we absolutely needed to sue. And I gave the green light to our legal director. We started working all night long and filed a habeas petition at 5 a.m. on Saturday morning on behalf of Mr. Darwish and all other people stranded at airports around the United States and around the world. We contacted the ACLU, we contacted Yale, and with the International Refugee Assistance Project, we filed the first lawsuit. And that Saturday night, Mr. Darwish achieved the first legal victory of any migrant or refugee against this administration when we had an emergency hearing and he was released. And when Mr. Darwish was released and he saw at the press conference all of these protesters, people like you, everyday Americans who had come out to airports, including here in Honolulu, I believe, saying, this is not who we are, and we cannot allow this administration to do that, and signs welcoming refugees. Mr. Darwish, in tears, said, this is humanity. He said, this is the soul of America. This is why I came. And just think about that. Just think what level of courage and resilience it takes for someone who has been traveling across the world, not having any idea that there is an executive order being drafted and about to change our fate and the fate of millions of people around the world, but found it within his wherewithal to say, this is unjust, and I'm going to fight for everybody, and I'm going to fight for the principles that this nation is built on. And that is who Mr. Darwish is. And as you know, the story doesn't end there. Hawaii, your former Attorney General Doug Chin, who I had a chance to work with over the last couple of years, and an incredible team at the Attorney General's office, Hawaii took the lead on suing against the Muslim ban. We had a separate lawsuit as well at the National Immigration Law Center, along with some of our colleagues in the immigrant rights community, and those cases have gone up to the Supreme Court. Unfortunately, as you know, the Supreme Court has now given it its imprimatur, and we now have a rubber stamp of this administration allowing for a shameful Muslim and refugee ban to be in place. We continue to litigate, particularly against the waiver provisions that say that the exception, the Supreme Court said, the one exception is because the administration is allowing for people to apply for a waiver, then it's okay. We can allow this Muslim ban to remain on the books. The fact is that only about 1% of these waivers are actually being approved. And so we're litigating. We're continuing to fight in the courts. But we also know that that isn't enough. That's not the only fight that we have. The second lesson that I learned was that while we have to defeat anti-immigrant and anti-refugee, anti-Muslim laws and policies, we must have a people-centered approach. What we're talking about is not simply violations of laws or unjust laws. We are talking about people's humanity, people having their soul broken, because that is what this administration is attempting to do. And when President Trump was elected, we knew and were preparing for the DACA program for immigrant youth to be terminated. As you may know, there are about 700,000 young people in this country who have been here, just like me, since the age of 3, the age of 5, 10 years old. They all came prior to the age of 16. There are about 700,000 of them who now have this protection from deportation called DACA, the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. And because we knew that was going to be at risk, within 3 hours of when President Trump, and actually it was Jeff Sessions, because President Trump wasn't courageous enough to get on the TV and say that he was terminating the program, when Jeff Sessions announced that they were terminating the DACA program, within 3 hours we were able to sue. And we were able to sue because a young man by the name of Martin Vidal Batalla found it again, just like Mr. Darwish, within himself the courage to sue this administration. Martin is a young man who grew up in Queens, New York. He is as Queens gets. He is as Queens as President Trump. He has been here since he was 7 years old, and all he wants is to remain in the Big Apple. This is his home. He considers New York home. And Martin was willing to sue on behalf of himself and all other young immigrants in this country to block this administration. And we sued on behalf of a number of them out of the 2nd District in New York, and we have been fighting that fight. But Martin also started receiving hate mail and hate messages and tweets. And those were all messages full of hatred based not only on anti-immigrant sentiments, but also on homophobic sentiments, because he is a queer young man who happens to have DACA. His father's name is also Martin, and so his father was also being attacked. And so at the end of our oral argument in New York, when we were fighting and arguing that we should have this program, that the administration should be blocked from terminating this program, we were able to then also present Martin with a book that had messages from people just like you, from across the country, from little towns all over the nation, saying to Martin how much they appreciated his courage, sending him messages of love, that love does trump hate. And it was that ability to see that actually the arguments we were making in court, although they were important to stop that action from this administration, that recognizing Martin's humanity was even more important. And to achieve the level of transformational change that we want and envision in this country, it is necessary for us, especially those of us who work within the legal system and who are fighting to transform our laws and policies, to have a people-centered approach. And so, in addition to fighting for the litigation, one of the things that we did immediately was also to fight in Congress. Immediately after we filed that lawsuit, we then joined and launched the Defend Our Dreams campaign with the United We Dream Network, which is the largest network of undocumented immigrant youth that was founded out of our Washington, D.C. office. And it was here, when we launched that campaign, that I had my third lesson in the last couple of years. And that third mistake was that I underestimated what was possible and what this administration was truly about. And what I mean by that is that when we launched the Defend Our Dreams campaign, we did so not only with immigrant youth at the lead, right? They were co-leading this campaign, but we knew that we also needed to have representation from border groups. We needed to have representation from Asian Pacific Islanders, especially Korean migrants, who are one of the largest Filipino and Korean migrants are the largest DACA recipients. And then third, we also needed representation from Black immigrants who are underrepresented in the broader immigrant rights movement. And we fought this, and we were working in Congress, and I have to say, I naively, really, I think there was a part of me that just wanted to hope that given what was happening, and given that President Trump was making comments about, quote, I have a heart for dreamers, and that he was really doing this so that Congress would do the right thing and enact legislation, there was a part of me that truly believed that we could win in Congress. And it wasn't until January of last year that we were sitting in our Washington, D.C. office with the leadership of the Undocu Black Network that we got word. We were in a meeting, and at that moment, one of our policy directors stopped, and we knew something was happening and didn't know exactly what. And he read a Washington Post article that commented and had reported on President Trump making his whole comment about people from Haiti and African countries. And it was at that moment that I realized, although I knew this, but I hadn't fully embodied it, that what is underlying this administration is white supremacy and white nationalists. And it was at that moment that I knew that we could not negotiate with white supremacists, that we could not negotiate with white nationalists. And this is what the blueprint of this administration is. This is the agenda. Their agenda is absolutely to change the makeup of who we look like in this nation. They want to erase Black and brown people from the future of this country. And it is a violent agenda. It is an agenda when you demonize and you dehumanize and you criminalize people, that narrative allows for hate crimes to exist. That narrative allows for synagogues to be, for killings, mass killings to happen, for bombs to go around, not just here in the continental US, but around the world. And it is because of those lessons, though, that I actually started becoming so politically clear about what we're really up against. And in the midst of the hatred and the racism that we're seeing coming from the Steve Bannons of the world, from Steve Miller, and many other people around President Trump, it was in the midst of that that we also saw the resilience of our communities. And Undocu Black, which is an organization that was born on MLK weekend of 2016, so just a little bit over 3 years ago, they were born because they felt, this is undocumented Black immigrants on the continental US feeling invisible. Within the movement for Black lives, they were not seen for their full humanity. They were not seen for being undocumented. And in the immigrant rights movement, they were not seen as Black immigrants. And so they formed their own organization. And I had the great honor of being one of 3 non-Black immigrants during their opening convening 3 years ago. And it was a space that was created for healing the trauma that Black undocumented immigrants and their Black ancestors have experienced. It was a space to create safety, and it was also a space to dream of a different tomorrow for all of us. And in the middle of the fight for DREAM and for DACA, the leadership of Undocu Black started fighting for Black immigrants, that this administration was terminating their temporary protected status. People who have been here for decades, people like Liberians in Rhode Island, where I grew up, who have been here since the 1980s and have called this nation their home, suddenly are at risk of being deported because this administration is taking away their temporary protection. And the Undocumented Black Network decided to fight for the most vulnerable among them. And just last month, 4 Liberians, we're talking about 4,000 Liberians in this nation, actually got President Trump to back off. It is one of the most important victories that we have had. We're talking about 4,000 Black immigrants who most people didn't even know existed, including within the immigrant rights movement, because of the anti-Blackness that exists within the movement. But yet, because they came together, because we had allies who we ensured were doing their work, people like organizations like Indivisible, for example, which also was born after the presidential elections, started fighting. So allies, white people, APIs, Latinx, Black immigrants, all of us coming together for a collective future. And when we look at that, when we look at what was possible, that is what gives me hope, because it is that work out of healing trauma that is allowing us to imagine a different world for all of us, a collective future for all of us. And what we know is that at the federal level, the situation is dire. There is a vacuum of political and moral leadership at many, many levels, not just at the White House. But this is a political vacuum that is costly. It is having humanitarian costs. It is having economic costs. It is costing our standing in the world in terms of who wants to come, whether as a tourist, as a student, as a worker to this country, knowing that we are closing the doors on so many people, including many of our families and loved ones, and that we are losing people. We are losing people not only because people are in fear, but we are losing people because people are committing suicide. People are taking their lives because of the fear. People are dying in jail, both children with our taxpayer money. Children are dying in immigration jails. And we are allowing for that unless we speak up and do more than we're doing right now. And what we know is that this is a moment that we are being called upon to ask ourselves, are we doing enough? This is not a time to think, like I did briefly, that it could be business as usual. This is not a time to sit by the sidelines. And in my days here in Hawaii, over the last couple of days, I have been learning so much about the wonderful community that you all have here and the great work that is being done, for example, at the University of Hawaii in terms of providing resident tuition for all students regardless of status. But I can tell you that for many of the students at the university, it is still not enough. For the 1 out of every 5 immigrant workers in Hawaii, they're still working with fear. Fear that they may be detained by immigration, fear that their wages may be stolen by their employer because they might be retaliated against, fear that a family member might get detained, fear that if they depend on any kind of safety net program like nutrition or housing or healthcare, that they may end up being removed from their families and denied a green card in the future, even though they're lawfully present in Hawaii. And that is if the public charge rule that this administration has proposed goes forward and becomes law. So we're seeing so many states and localities, so many allies. Some of our strongest allies are educators, pediatricians who should be worried about whether their patients who are children have asthma attacks or preventing diabetes, but instead they're treating children for toxic stress. They're treating children for trauma and anxiety. One of the first meetings I had during the first quarter of this administration with the leadership of the American Academy of Pediatricians, their leadership explained to me that they were seeing a trend in their offices happening, which was either patients were not showing up for appointments, or if they were showing up with the same rationale for why the parents were bringing their children in, was that there was fear of Trump. Literally, on patients' medical records, doctors were writing fear of Trump as the reason why a parent had brought a 4-year-old into a medical office. And the level of psychological trauma and medical trauma that we are causing children, we as a society don't yet even understand the long-term consequences of that. But we see pediatricians right now going to the border. We see pediatricians filing amicus briefs and declarations in our lawsuits. We see pediatricians speaking up. We see educators not only doing what might be possibly politically or feasible, but actually going the extra mile. And this is a time when we must disobey unjust laws. And every single one of us has to be asking ourselves, what else do I need to be doing? Right? This is a time for us to say, how do I step up? What am I doing to protect and defend the rights of Micronesians? What am I doing to defend the rights of people from the Marshall Islands or from Palau, from the Philippines? Right? We absolutely must be doing more. And Hawaii has been playing an incredible leadership role on climate change, for example. But migration is one of the defining issues of our time. And when we think of climate change and migration as some of the major forces that will cause much more migration throughout the world, including to Hawaii, we have to ask, what is Hawaii doing? Is it doing enough? Right? And as taxpayers, we all must be asking, what more do we do? And so this is a pivotal moment in history. It is one that's calling on us to truly live into the promise of the democratic project called the United States of America, in which we are all and have been created equally. When we all have been created with those certain unalienable rights, including life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and to finally reckon with the violent founding of this nation, with the genocide of indigenous people, the robbing of lands, the raping of women, the killings of queer people, the forced migration of blacks after having been enslaved from Africa. We absolutely must reckon with our history in order to heal from this trauma, this national trauma, and be able to give birth to the America that we must become. And one of the reasons I am actually so hopeful is because when I think of the work that you all are doing here, when I think of the Aloha spirit, a spirit that, as I am beginning to understand it, is one that recognizes the importance of you cannot thrive unless I thrive. I cannot thrive unless you thrive. If I am not healthy, you are not healthy. Right? If I don't have work, that is going to affect you, and vice versa. And our communities, the global community, all interdependent. And my liberation depends on your liberation. Your freedom depends on my freedom. And that aloha spirit, in a state that is so diverse as Hawaii, which is what the rest of the continent of the United States is becoming, you have an experience, a lived experience that is actually much different, that the rest of the United States does not yet know or understand. When this nation is having a conversation about the US-Mexico border and erecting a wall with taxpayer money, right, and the declaration of a national emergency using, again, our taxpayer money, in Hawaii being one of the 3 states most impacted by that national emergency, that is all political theatrics. And I say that because that is all Donald Trump basically trying to rile up a base that, again, is grounded in white nationalism and white supremacy. And the fact is that conversation about the US-Mexico border is so outdated. The facts are that there's net migration from Mexico the United States. The facts are that there is an increase in migrants coming from the northern triangle of Central America, but they are coming to seek safety. They are coming to seek asylum, which they have a right to do so under both US and international laws. And they are coming because they are being pushed out of their homelands because of climate change and because of violence that is mostly all based on gender-based violence and femicide, violence that is being enacted mostly by gangs that were gang members deported from LA. Right? This is the United States' own foreign policies and interventions in Central America are exactly what are causing people to migrate to the United States. So until we deal with those root causes and until people have the freedom to remain in their homelands and be able to thrive so that they are not forced to migrate, we will continue dealing with people migrating. But the facts also say that the fastest growing immigrant population in the United States are Asians. People coming from China and India are the ones who are overstaying visas. It is not people from Mexico. You would never know that based on the political rhetoric in the United States. But again, it's this anti-Mexican, anti-Latino, anti-Black, anti-immigrant, anti-Muslim rhetoric that is what is the distraction. And we have an opportunity to change that. We have an opportunity for Hawaii to help lead the way and to show the rest of the country that a diverse state, that richness in this state, that aloha spirit actually is what the whole nation should have and what the whole world should have. And until we have the ability for people to have that freedom to remain, the freedom to move freely just as capital does, just as technology and knowledge does, just as wealthy people get to do, until we have that freedom to thrive where we can all have the ability to fulfill our full potential regardless of where we were born or how much money we have, regardless of our gender identity or our race or our faith, we must all have that freedom to thrive. And until we have those things, you and I will not be able to be free. We will not be able to live a life of dignity because we will all be impacting each other and we need each other. And so in closing, I will say that these last few days that I've been here learning about the aloha spirit, I am hopeful. I am hopeful because I am getting to meet a community here that I think is hungry for doing much more, for Hawaii being able to lead the way, for the University of Hawai to become an exemplar of what other universities in the nation can do, for your attorney general, your governor's office, to go beyond, right, to be able to be that progressive voice in the nation, to show the rest of the country that having diversity, that having people from all over Asia and Pacific Islanders, for example, having people give their best and be their best actually benefits all of us. And so with that, I say mahalo. I'm happy to answer questions from all of you and to hear from many of the experts in the room as well. Gracias.
And then turn on the podium mic. Okay, we are ready for questions.
We have had here in Hawaii the presence, and including on this campus, of groups like the Proud Boys who say they are supporters of Western civilization, but then in online chat rooms are openly and violently anti-Semitic and Nazi white supremacists. So this is a kind of a poison that has spread everywhere. And I wonder if you, and I think it's a defensive move to kind of dismiss them as a small group of crazy people. But I wonder if you could say more about the ways in which this administration has worked hand in hand with these groups, including right at the border, to terrorize people and to promote violence.
Yes, thank you for that. And just wanted to recognize both Mari and Charles Lawrence. You in Hawaii are so fortunate to have these brilliant legal minds who many of us who are law students or lawyers admire from all over the continent of the US. So thank you for that question. There is no mistaking that this administration is not only coordinating with people who have those views, but actually that the team, that the people who are drafting laws and policies, especially the anti-immigrant policies that we at the National Immigration Law Center are working to defend against, are people who've espoused those views and who are actually engaging in violence. And in fact, some of you may have heard that in New Mexico, just last week, a quote-unquote militia was detained of people, white supremacists, who basically were kidnapping immigrants or people they perceived to be undocumented immigrants to hold them for border patrol. Kidnapping, violence, hatred, hate violence, all of that is being perpetrated across the nation. And in fact, we have seen an increase in hate crimes because of people who are actually feeling completely emboldened by this administration, including Border Patrol and immigration agents themselves, who again have felt and have said that they feel that their handcuffs and shackles have been taken off and that their man in the White House has their back. And so it is clear that that coordination is happening. And in fact, I would also remind us that that coordination is now happening across the globe. Steve Bannon has left the White House to take his agenda, his white nationalist agenda, across the world and coordinating with other white supremacist groups and white nationalist groups in other parts of the world, both in the EU and in even in Latin America. And that coordination is happening. That coordination is happening both among governments, among right ideologues. It's happening among transnational corporations, and it's one of the things that I believe we need to do more of in the United States is actually radical transnational cooperation with our sister organizations and other movement across the globe that are actually seeking freedom for all of us and seeking a world in which we all can live and live with dignity and thrive and be free.
Question here.
You mentioned there was a victory with the Liberians, but you didn't describe it, so I'm wondering if you could do that.
Sure. So there are a couple of things that happened with Liberians. The administration announced the termination of the Temporary Protected Status Program, as well as the Deferred Enforced Departure for Liberians, DED. And all of them had different expiration dates, and there were lawsuits filed, including one specifically for Liberians. But it was through advocacy, both in Congress and in the media. There was a very strong communication strategy, and in the courts after the lawsuit was filed, where I think just the different convergence of different forces basically put enough pressure on the administration to back down. And what was interesting about that is the backing down was temporary. All they've done now is extend their work authorization through March of 2020. But in this moment, every victory counts. Every single victory. There is no victory that is too small. And in fact, I would really say that this is a moment in which we need to be redefining what success means. And part of that success is building the grassroots organizing that needs to happen to bring about the change and ensuring that the people who are directly impacted by these policies are at the front, that they are leading the strategy, that they are telling their stories. One of the things about this that is so powerful is that less than a year ago, most people did not even know what TPS was, temporary protected status, including people on the Hill. And in a matter of months, that level of education was able to get done because people with TPS and DED, Liberians, Haitians, people from Nicaragua, from Honduras, were telling their stories and were going to the Hill to tell their stories, to meet with congressmen and women to ensure that they were actually trying to stop this administration from ending the program. And I think it was the combination of advocacy on the Hill, the organizing on the grassroots level throughout the country, working with congressional delegates, and the lawsuit that all combined to get this White House to back off. And it's the only policy that they have backed off on. So it's a huge, huge victory for the Liberian community.
Nandita, and I'm going to ask that everyone maybe stand up for a moment when you ask your question, just for our live streaming audience.
Hi. I just wanted to push the discussion about migration a little bit further than the law, which is we live in a world in which both national and international law upholds the idea that national sovereigns have the right to control mobility. And we live in a world where the imagination of people is that that is just. And I'm wondering, at this moment in time, when we are seeing, and not for the first time, the incredible horrors that come with limiting people's mobility, whether we can actually push forward and challenge the right of states to limit people's mobility. And what that looks like in a moment as dire as this one, where even just the basic things that we took for granted since 1965 in the United States are being challenged.
Thank you for that question, Nandita. So I think that this is a moment in which we're being called, frankly, to evoke our moral imagination, and that absolutely we shouldn't be looking at the current legal constructs. And I think to also be reminded that the current existence of borders have not always been there, or even the current laws have not always been the laws, right? And just putting that, all of that into the broader context of history, I think is really critical. And one of the things that we found in this last year is that we started doing some analysis at the National Immigration Law Center about where we were at. And when we lost the DACA fight, one of the recognitions was that from many of the groups in the immigrant justice world is that we lost because we don't have enough political power, and we also lost because there isn't a long-term vision. There isn't a shared vision and narrative for what we're fighting for. And so much of the fight has actually been a fight for policies, right? They've been like, let's get comprehensive immigration reform, let's get the DREAM Act passed. And again, that is the big shift. It's like that can't be the way that can't be what we're fighting for, because those are all short-term fixes rather than really transformative changes, which is what's needed. And so when we started checking in with many of the stakeholders across the country and learning this, we then decided to engage many of our partners in a long-term visioning process. And we have come together for the last 9 months with about 45 groups from across the nation to basically really reimagine. And the freedom of mobility is absolutely one of the places that we've landed, in that has to be the direction that we're moving in as a movement for immigrant justice, and that one that really grounds our understanding of even citizenship being redefined, right? For migrants who have been in the United States fighting for comprehensive immigration reform, for example, where the path to citizenship was considered as an end goal, well, getting citizenship does not, if you are a Black person in this nation, that doesn't mean you are safe from being killed by the police. Right? If you are a citizen in this nation, it doesn't mean that as a woman, you're not going to be sexually assaulted, or that you're not going to have your wages stolen by an employer because you're a citizen. And so we know that even the concept of citizens has to be reimagined and redefined, and that is a place where I think understanding that we can't look at migration from a domestic lens in the United States, but instead from a global lens, and really start working with our partners, especially in the global South, to really try to imagine, what does a borderless world look like? What does a more humane migration system look like around the world? One that is grounded on racial and gender and economic equality and equity, that has to be part of the changes that we make. And it may take as many years to get there, but unless we start imagining what that could be, and think about the new changes in the laws that would need to follow, and change the narrative and the culture so that it creates the conditions for those laws and policies to change. But that's, I think, exactly where many of us are currently thinking as well.
Okay, we have another question here.
Good evening. My name is Danica Ramos. So I know you mentioned United We Dream. So I used to work for United We Dream in DC when the Defend Our Dreams campaign launched. So I used to work with a lot of my colleagues on the streets at the White House when DACA ended. During the time I used to work with a lot of those organizers, a lot of them faced a lot of mental health issues, anxiety and depression, and especially my former coworkers who I used to work with, they were undocumented, and not only were they fighting, doing work in the immigration movement, but they were also fighting for their own personal lives as well. And so I guess my question is, and you probably know this as well, is can you elaborate how, especially in the immigration movement, how you've integrated mental health as a priority, especially when a lot of, I remember my experience working with my fellow colleagues, didn't usually have the access or could afford to get the mental health services they needed to be able to cope with the trauma that was just exacerbated during the Trump administration?
Yes, thank you, and thank you for your work and your leadership as well. So yes, mental health actually has become increasingly of great importance to many of the organizations. So much of the trauma, as I mentioned earlier, is being experienced not only in the immigrant communities themselves, but in many of our organizations. In fact, we at the National Immigration Law Center, we're a majority people of color staff. Many of us are immigrants. We have DACA staff. We have staff members who are affected by the Muslim ban or whose family members were affected by the Muslim ban. And the level of trauma, as well as secondary and tertiary trauma from the work that we are doing, affects us all. And especially with respect to access to health, which again, for many undocumented immigrants, that is not even possible. One of the things that we've been doing is working to actually achieve access to health care for all, regardless of immigration status. In California, we fought for that. First, we were able to achieve that for children through age 18, and now we're trying to achieve that for adults as well. We're working with actually United We Dream leadership in Connecticut, for example, to try to do the same thing, and in a number of other states. And that's, again, something that would be important for Hawaii to be thinking about more in terms of where are the gaps, and ensuring that mental health is part of that provision. We're working very closely with community health centers, which often are the places where many low-income people, not just immigrants, would be going to seek the care. The other thing is also looking at self-care in different ways that community organizers could work promotoras, which is a concept in the Spanish language of community members themselves who understand what wellness is and using natural remedies and other forms to take care of each other. And again, it's also about finding different ways of doing the work. Right? Different ways of ensuring that we are taking care of ourselves. At the National Immigration Law Center, one of the things that we did, we were really fortunate to have someone who approached us early on in the Trump administration who had done work with refugees in civil war areas and basically offered pro bono to come to our staff and teach us mindfulness practices and help us so that staff individuals would be able to learn how to deal with their own stress. We also created a wellness fund so that staff would have money to be able to pay to go, whether it was a yoga class, go to meditation, get medical care, pay for a mental health session, whatever staff members need. And we're finding many, many more groups in the immigrant justice world actually prioritizing mental health. The Undocu Black Network, again, I will continue to talk about them as one of the really leading lights in our movement and in our country. Mental health is a central part of their strategy, and they have been creating, again, resources for many of the undocumented Black membership that they have that don't have access to anything and that are facing many, many layers of trauma and mental health issues as well. So absolutely really important. Thank you for the question.
Just a couple of more questions.
Mahalo for your vision of radical inclusion. That is deeply appreciated. I wonder if you could give us an update on the issue of domestic violence and how that has been bandied about as a legitimate and a not a legitimate category for being admitted into asylum protections. I know the colleagues and friends I have at the Annunciation House in El Paso. I've spoken to the medics there and the doctors, and they say, we are not really capable. And so many people need this. So many women, mainly women, need this issue of domestic violence. And it's, I mean, as recently as I've heard, it's no longer a legitimate category for asylum status.
Yes, unfortunately, so I'll touch on two different pieces. So unfortunately, the former Attorney General, Jeff Sessions, did, and one of the things that we're seeing under this administration, both with the Attorney General Sessions and now with Attorney General Barr, is that they have taken it upon themselves to actually intervene in individual cases, which you had never, was just unheard of. And that, one of the things that Jeff Sessions did do was actually take away the domestic violence category as one of the categories that was considered a social protected category for purposes of seeking asylum. The other thing that is also happening with domestic violence is that anyone who has even been arrested or charged for domestic violence in certain parts of the U.S. continent, we're seeing those individuals detained and deported, even if that conviction or even if that arrest was 10, 15, 20 years ago, even people with green cards. And so there is a zero tolerance approach under this administration. The other thing that I'll say, I think your question reminded me, is that it's important to learn from the strategies that this administration is employing. And part of what I have learned is they came in with a long-term vision. They came in with a very clear blueprint, and that blueprint has been drafted and created over the last 20 plus years. They're implementing it right now. They're not wasting any time. They know that they're in office for a short period of time, whether it's 2 years, 4 years, 8 years. And I say 8 years because unless every single one of us does everything in our power to ensure that in 2020 there is a different presidential outcome, this administration is likely to get reelected. I truly, truly believe that that is possible unless every single one of us does everything within our power to change that. But because they know that they're only in office for a few years or more than that, they're taking radical approaches. They're not tinkering around the edges. They are literally trying to completely remake the immigration system and many, many other changes as well. And so when there is a change in administration, it's a good reminder that tinkering around the edges and having incremental approaches is not going to be how we even get back to where we were on November 7th of 2016. And so it's another reason why reimagining what is needed to actually get the country back on the right path is going to need to take a lot of courage and leadership.
Just 2 more questions.
Okay, one here.
Hi. A year ago, several newspapers reported that 1,500 undocumented minors, unaccompanied minors, were lost. They were placed in host families, and there hasn't been any information as to their current status. Do you have any update on that?
Yes, thank you for the question. So I don't have the latest information about where that is, but it is extremely complicated and obscure. And I don't know if Josh from the ACLU is here. I don't see him right now, but the ACLU has been the main organization leading that fight, and the administration has been lying consistently. This is an administration, and again, especially because of the Border Patrol, is an agency that sees themselves as having no liability and not being accountable to anyone. And we continue to hear stories of even today unaccompanied minors still being detained, people getting lost within the system. The administration is not being forthcoming with the information, but I don't have the specifics about that particular piece in the 1,500. Really would encourage you to work with or reach out to the ACLU here in Hawaii. There are also incredible groups on the border like Al Otro Lado, that is working on both the U.S. and Mexico side, both in San Diego and in Tijuana, to help a lot of those communities, as well as Haitian Bridge Alliance, which is working with Haitians that are also coming at the border, many of whom the news doesn't even talk about, but who have been similarly seeking safety in our nation for for the last couple of years as well.
Hello, my name is Bo Ewan. I'm an English professor at Kapi'olani Community College. And on behalf of my students, many of whom are undocumented, I first and foremost want to thank you for the work that you're doing. Next, I'm curious, of the 2020 presidential candidates, which do you think has the most progressive and meaningful platform in terms of immigration? And really, what advice would you give to them to undo some of the anti-immigrant sentiment that has ravaged this country during the course of this administration?
So that's an easy answer. None of them have issued a platform with the exception of Julian Castro. And so it's unfortunate. Julian Castro is the only Latino who is currently running for president on the Democratic side. He has, his platform is a good start. It starts from the premise that actually he's seeking a Marshall Plan to address the challenges in Central America, and to, again, look at the root causes, which is absolutely, I think, the way we need to be going. He does believe in a path to citizenship, both for young immigrants, but for all undocumented immigrants in the U.S. And I think that right now, they are being cautious, right? And many of them are progressive. There's a whole range of progressiveness. Some are liberal, some I would not say are even progressive. But I think that this is a moment, as I mentioned earlier, where there is a vacuum of leadership. I'm hoping that many of the Democratic candidates will understand that actually this is a moment to be leading and to be leaning in with a vision for the country. I think it's great that we have so many candidates because it's an opportunity for the country to hear a different vision of what America should become and who we want to be in our standing in the world, and what their agenda is for migration. And we at the National Immigration Law Center and our C4 sister agency, which is the NILC Immigrant Justice Fund, will be working on developing a platform on immigration for the campaigns, and hoping that as many of them will take as much of that as possible. But right now, it is absolutely dead silence on immigration, which is really shameful.
Thank you, Marielena. Thank you, Adela. Thank you, David. Thank you, Josh. Josh, you look like you're carrying a box.
I'm getting used to going to every meeting and getting lays. This is going to be really difficult when I go back to the continent. Oh, thank you so much.
From all of us.
Thank you. Thank you so much.